Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. The presentation today is about the findings of research that was conducted, as Eva said, by myself along with two Rohingya women leaders in the camp, Showkutara and Minara, both of whom you will hear from in the course of this presentation. And it follows about a year of consultations and workshops that Showkutara and Minara did, initially just with women in the camp. So they each lead their own organizations, and they were speaking to women who are members of their organization or in some way engaged with their organization about the various justice processes. And eventually a demand built up for this, and men also wanted to receive these types of trainings, and so they actually have also done a series of workshops with men in the camp as well. The workshops focused on the justice processes at the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, investigations by the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the IIMM, and also the Universal Jurisdiction case in Argentina. And some of the really clear findings from this process of talking to so many women in the camp was that they, first of all, were really unaware of the different justice processes going on. And second of all, when they were made aware by Showkutara and Minara, they were surprised about the type of justice that was prioritized by these different mechanisms. And many of them felt that the type of justice that the international community has been pursuing isn't the same as what they consider justice to be, and also the mechanisms that have been set up for Rohingya to try to engage in these processes they felt weren't very accessible to women in the camp. And so the findings of the research are going to go into more detail about those opinions that were quite frequently discussed with Minara and Showkutara over the year that we were implementing this project. So the first thing that we wanted to do when we were looking at this issue of women kind of being excluded or feeling like they hadn't been adequately included in the justice process was to put it in the wider context of the women, peace and security agenda and look at the extent to which international frameworks in general have been effective at being able to bring in women who have been victimized by various crimes to be able to participate in, what that framework, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, has set out to achieve. And, particularly looking at whether the Women, Peace and Security agenda is something that is really relevant or speaks to the Rohingya community. So as you probably know, the WPS agenda began in the year 2000 with the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And this marked a real shift in thinking about women's role in conflict from people who are just victims, and usually victims of sexual violence, to people who have their own agency and can be change makers and peacemakers and play a really important role actually in bringing conflicts to a close and rebuilding society afterwards. So Resolution 1325 has been followed by another 9 resolutions, so there's 10 altogether on the agenda, 5 of which are more focused on the role of women in peace building, and 5 of which are more focused on the role of women and transitional justice. And it was really notable that when the 5 resolutions were speaking about women's role in peace building, they were very clear that women were not just the recipients of the peace building process. It wasn't something that, they should be involved only at the end stages of the process where the peace was being delivered to the community. But it was vitally important that women are involved from the very beginning in the design of the peace-building mechanisms and processes that are able to deliver a peaceful transition to the community. So you can see language in those resolutions that talk about how important it is. it is that they are there from the early stages of the process, that they have to play a role in developing the strategies and designing what this, whatever it is. Of course, it looks different in different communities, but they're very clear that women need to play a role in the design of what it actually looks like and how it functions. And when you get to the Transitional Justice Security Council resolutions and how they speak about how women should be included, it's a very different picture. Women then are considered more just recipients of the justice process. How can the justice process serve women? And when they're talking about that, they're mainly conceptualizing women as victims of sexual violence. And so kind of harking back to that pre-2000 understanding of women just as victims of the war. There's only one of these 5 resolutions that talk about the importance of involving women in the actual design of the transitional justice mechanism, so that they're not just there, at the end of the process, but they're actually involved in the thinking around what it should look like and how it can best serve the community. But then, even when it does this, it completely conflates survivors of sexual gender-based violence and women. And of course, there is a big overlap, but it speaks about the need that women be involved in the design of transitional justice mechanisms and processes, from the very beginning, not because they're just half of the population, and of course these mechanisms will not be able to serve everybody unless everybody is participating in their design, but because they are survivors of sexual violence and therefore they need to get justice for the violations that they've experienced. So you can see here in this sentence, it starts the sentence talking about survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and says, we need to ensure their meaningful participation. And then it says, because we recognize that women's leadership and participation will increase the likelihood that these justice processes will be effective, thereby, assuming just within the same sentence that women and victims of sexual and gender-based violence are one and the same, and the victimhood is the reason that they should be able to be participating in the design of these mechanisms. And even this recognition that women should be included in that design comes very late into the piece. This is one of the later resolutions from 2019. And so before that, though what people were really thinking about women's inclusion from the beginning stages of the peace-building process, there is this gap where women have not really been considered designers or architects of what transitional justice should look like. And so now, when we're thinking of the Rohingya crisis, we can see echoes of that general framework in the current situation, where there are multiple justice avenues that are available to the Rohingya, but it hasn't been the case that really any Rohingya, but Rohingya women in particular, have been able to play a guiding or strategic role in what that justice should actually look like for their community. So we looked at the different processes that have been set up, the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, the ICC, ICJ, the investigations of the IIMM, and the universal jurisdiction case in Argentina. We also looked at the extent to which these different mechanisms are able to engage with victims and the extent to which they're able to engage with women or take women's input into account in the way that they carry out their investigations. And of all of them, the ICC is really sort of the furthest developed in probably both of these areas. Certainly in terms of victim participation, a lot of work has gone into trying to improve the extent to which victims can engage with the court. There is the VPRS department exists for that purpose. There's an outreach section that tries to reach out to the community and ensure that they are continuously updated and that they're able to engage with the court as it does its investigations. There also is a lot of thinking has been put into ensuring that the court effectively is able to support investigations of sexual and gender-based violence, and there is there's a special advisor for this purpose. Also, with some of these other mechanisms, there is a particular focus on sexual and gender-based violence, but it's not necessarily the case with most of them that they're that they have really developed mechanisms in place for engaging victims in general, and particular trying to engage female victims. There's not necessarily a special part of these mechanisms that's able to address the particular challenges that they might face, and also people of other genders, such as the Hijra, might face in being able to bring their concerns to the court. The IIM is another mechanism that it has been working on. It certainly met many victims in the camp. It has a gender advisor on board. It does apparently have a draft outreach strategy and a draft gender strategy, but it hasn't released either of those. And we would suggest perhaps that having those circulate amongst people in the camp, so they, as kind of the experts in how to engage them, would be able to input on the design of what they can look like to make them the best versions of, what they could be. And so now we're going to hear from Showkutara, who is one of the women leaders in the camp, and this is her reflections after she'd carried out these trainings on the different justice mechanisms, on the extent to which they were able to engage women, and her sort of, I guess, concerns about the gaps in that respect.
Assalamualaikum. This is Rita Kahsay. I'm Executive Director of RWAD. RWAD is a camp-based organization who working for women's empowerment, education, leadership, and awareness programs. Along with Minara, I have conducted training with over hundreds of women in the camp on justice process relevant to our community, including ICC, ICJ, IIM, and Argentina. Before training, when I asked women, do you know what is ICC, who are they, what they do? The majority of women did recognize the mechanism. When they came to know they were good, they gave response such as, ICC will solve our problem and we can go back home. We'll get right our back. We gave training to them about this mechanism. Finally, when they finished their training, they feel very sad when they realize the idea of the justice totally different than their idea of justice. Community think that justice means going home. According to my observation, most of the women don't care about punishment. They said that if they regret their crime, then we will forget them. One woman said on a training, peace comes from the peace, not from violence. Thank you so much.
Assalamualaikum. I'm Minara. I was Bazar refugee camp Taki. EWDRW, Education and Wisdom Development for Rohingya Women, Founder and Executive Director. Our group has education about the Hasguri, livelihood about the Hasguri, women empower about the Hasguri. Our group my honocolor do the training ICC, ICJ, IMM, Argentina, level Latin Coldi. Our group my total do shot. আর তো আর দিকে কেমন মাই হয় না কলা আছে দিতারা তো বেশি গুসা লাগে কেয়াল্লা হইলে জাস্টিস মেকানিজম হদে কি ইতারা কি কাম করে ইতারা আড়ালের হতাবার্তারা নহদি আলচরিয়া আর তো বেশি অশান্তি লাগে আর রোহিঙ্গার বিচারে বাদে আর রোহিঙ্গালের হতা না হয় তারা আইসিসির প্রসিকিউটরও করে কেমন মাঝে আইরে রোহিঙ্গা মাই হয় না কলের হতাবার্তারা নহয় ইতারা হতা হদে এনজিওর মানুষ লইতা আর হদুন মানুষের রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ দিবাতে এলা মানুষ সকলেরা হতা হোক ইয়ার পর দিনের ভিতরে আইসিসির ইনভেস্টিগেটরও কল আসে টাইমের মাঝে আর নিজে বাজে দলই টাইমের মাঝে ইতারা রিকোয়েস্ট করছি দে একাঙ্কি আইসিসি কুট কক্সবাজার এলাকার মাঝে আর আমরা রোহিঙ্গা ওই না পারে না কইরা ইতারা আর না পারে বলে কই জবাব দিয়ে আর তো জানতে মনে হয় দেখ কেমন ভিক্টিম দ্য উইকনেস করে আইসিসির মানুষ সকল আইসিসি কুলো যাই ডাইরেক্টলি হতা হই না পারে দিয়ে কি ল মাজা আছে দেনে দিয়া না তো জানতে মনে হয় আর হতা হল মৌকা দিয়ে আমরা বলি বিশেষ শুকরিয়া আসসালামু আলাইকুম.
So you can see from those interventions by Showkutara and Minara that for them themselves, but also for the women that they have spent the last year speaking to in the camp, there still are these gaps and these frustrations with feeling like these processes haven't really engaged them from the beginning. Or if they have, I guess there might be a gap in terms of the extent to which these mechanisms feel like they've been able to effectively engage, and then the way that the women in the community are actually receiving that, and the extent to which they have really been able to understand what these processes are and what they would be able to deliver them. So we have a line in the article that we wrote together that says, for justice processes to be able to serve women, they must be able to include women in conversations about their establishment, scope, focus, and outcomes. And the way that these justice mechanisms have been set up in general, not just in the Rohingya context, is that it is very difficult for them to develop or initiate in response to input from the victim communities. They're sort of, the way that they operate is they get started and they proceed through a particular type of mandate and with a particular type of input, which isn't necessarily the instructions or advice from the victim community about how they would want those processes to proceed and what they think that justice should look like or does look like to them. And again, as with as we were looking at with the mechanisms before, the ICC is the most advanced in this area, and the VPRS did go to the Rohingya community and hold quite a lot of consultations before opening an investigation to try to ensure that it got everybody's feedback, and it released a report on that in which it said that it did feel comfortable that it had gotten feedback from a very large number of people in the Rohingya community, saying that even I think that every single Rohingya in the camp does want this investigation to open, and that they've been able to kind of explain it to all of these different groups. But when Showkutara and Minara actually spoke to the women in the camp, it was really clear that they didn't know, and I think Showkutara and Minara might speak about this a bit later, but they really didn't know the difference between the mechanisms or what each mechanism did. And so many things about this process are already underway, and I don't think we have time to go into the recommendations actually for the different mechanisms at the moment, but this is an article that we can definitely send to attendees and to a wider audience if people are interested in it. I think there's things that need to be rethought about the way that international justice is done in general to make it more responsive to the needs of victims, and particularly women from the community that they're intended to serve. But even as this process is underway right now, we did have some recommendations about how these mechanisms could make sure that they were kind of responding to and engaging with women. And so that is something that we hope we will be able to talk about a bit more in the session today. I will hand over now to Rita, who is going to speak about some slightly different experiences with women and international justice in the context of Tigrayan in Ethiopia.
Hello, and thank you for having me. I want to begin by first expressing my solidarity with the victims of these international crimes. The sisters from the Rohingya group and victims internationally, worldwide. Without further ado, I think I'll begin with generally what took place in the conflict in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray. That began on the 4th of November 2020 when the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, declared a war on the government of Tigray and the 7 million people in that region. This war resulted in one of the most dire humanitarian catastrophes in recent history. Hundreds of thousands have died due to the war, and millions have been displaced, and over 5 million people have been thrust into severe food insecurity. To highlight the topic and the gendered element of this war, one of the most reprehensible aspects of the war in Tigray has been the incidences of conflict-related sexual violence employed as a weapon of war and genocide due to the information blockade and siege imposed on Tigray by the Ethiopian government since the onset of the war until well after the Pretoria Agreement. The exact number of survivors was difficult to know. It's still quite uncertain. But an estimated number of 130,000 women in Tigray are said to have been subject to rape, gang rape, sexual slavery, and enforced impregnation and enforced sterilization as well. Survivors and witnesses have shared that the Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara forces have systematically perpetrated conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon in Tigray. The first opportunity for justice when these atrocity crimes were taking place was when the Ministry for Women and Children, Fulsan Mohammed, came to Mekelle mid-war to try to conduct research on the conflict-related sexual violence that was taking place in the region. Fulsan's team found extremely excruciating results. They found that the rape was systemic and was clearly intentional. Fulsan, as the Minister of Women, as a woman in government, was intimidated and harassed and was unable to speak out on what was taking place in Tigray, and as a result resigned. The next opportunity was the joint Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and OHCHR report research that was taking place. So with that report, the majority of the areas where these atrocities had taken place were inaccessible and not included in this report, which made this report massively incorrect. And this was this joint report generally was massively opposed by Tigrayans and the victims generally, because the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission had been responsible for incorrect reporting early on in the war that was very clearly government-sided. This report was actually quite extensive, but it was a report that minimized the state's participation in any war crimes and crimes against humanity, and maximized the crimes of the TDF, the opposing warring party, which again was very far away from the victims and the truth of what should have came out to offer these victims some justice. And with massive amounts of advocacy from organizations like ours, like Irovanina, the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia was set up by the UN. This commission's mandate was to investigate exactly what took place in the conflict in the north from November 2020, and to put out a report that would also give recommendations to the government of Ethiopia of how to handle this justice and accountability related stuff in the country. The Ethiopian government launched a campaign against ICRI, and also lobbied different governments, proposed different resolutions to defund this commission. The commission was prevented from doing their research in Ethiopia, so almost all of the victim groups were inaccessible. The next thing, they were also unable to go into Sudan, or prevented from going into Sudan, because the Ethiopian government had convinced the Sudanese not to let them in, and they were prevented from going into Djibouti. So again, the victims, particularly the victims of the gender-based violence, were unable to access any justice, or to give their truth to this commission, who had the mandate to bring out the truth of what took place. Following this, the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia had to conduct interviews virtually. Unfortunately, many of the of the attacks, or like the actual war, took place in rural areas, which then means that a lot of the conflict-related sexual violence also took part in rural areas where the majority of the population do not have access to education. They do not speak English. They wouldn't know what ICRI is, and therefore could not give their testimonies, to ICRI. For ICRI to be able to produce a fully comprehensive report. The Ethiopian government, back in March, when the annual human rights UN human rights session was to happen, and Ethiopia was on the agenda, drafted a resolution to end the mandate of ICRI, of the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts, on Ethiopia. And this draft letter was circulated internally. The European Union and the Western powers generally found out about this. They were convinced that had the Ethiopian government proposed this resolution, that would have been the end of ICRI and the end of any justice for the atrocity crimes that took place in the conflict. So what the European Union did was they did a backdoor deal with the Ethiopian government to hold off on proposing this resolution, and the European Union promised, if the Ethiopian government held off, that ICRI's mandate would definitely end in September 2023. Now, this is quite outrageous because, one, ICRI did not have access to the majority of the victim groups, so could not possibly produce a comprehensive report and do any of the victims any justice. Two, the Ethiopian government also used, particularly with African groups, also used anti-imperialist kind of sovereignty as a topic arguments against ICRI. But the irony was that the African Union had also set up a commission of inquiry to find out what took place in the conflict, but were prevented from entering Ethiopia, prevented from entering Sudan, and experienced the same hostility as ICRI. So the Ethiopian government was never really, although they used African solutions for African problems slogan as a topic, as a point of argument, they don't care about African solutions to African problems very clearly. The African Commission for Human Rights left, quietly cancelled this inquiry team back in June this year, 2023. So this leaves the victims, particularly the women in the most rural areas, that had to bear the brunt of the war without any justice, without any real justice.
So I'm going to read this question out just so the panelists can think about it. And then we'll either have Rita coming back or we will go to the questions. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. I could not agree more about the need for women to be in the driver's seat in the design and delivery of international justice related to their own lives and livelihoods. I'm curious, what is the message to the global donor community, specifically that supports these mechanisms and processes for international justice more inclusively? That's an excellent question that I'm sure everyone will be delighted to answer. And I think one thing that I'll say on behalf of Showkutara and Minara is they don't get very good funding at all. They get completely overlooked with the work that they do. And at one point, we even considered putting their budget into a report to the ICC to point out how easy it is to reach a large population with very limited funds. But I'm sure Showkutara and Minara will have their own contributions to make there. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Cunningham from the Aga Khan Foundation. Let's go now then, Shokutara. I will direct the first question to you. And now I'm going to invite Shafi here, who is our interpreter, to interpret the question for Shokutara. So I'm going to ask the question and then I'll pause for Shafi to do the interpretation. So you said in your observation that most of the women in the camp don't think of punishment as an important form of justice. So Claire said in the research that you did that women did care more about punishment for rape and sexual violence. So the question is, what kind of justice do women talk about wanting for sexual and gender-based crimes?
Shokutara,
First of all, thank you so much, Eva, for introducing me. I'm really honored to be a part of this webinar. Recently, we trained more than 100 women. When we talk about the punishment from the women, most of the women don't care about punishment. Just they are willing to return with full right and no more genocide happen in the future. Punishment means revenge, which we Rohingya women don't want. And some women share their feeling like that, like a GBB victim who are willing to punishment the perpetrator, like a rapist must be go jail like 5 years, 7 years. Also, another some women told me like that the justice mechanism should provide like financial support, training, and psychosocial support for the rape victim to heal their trauma. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Thank
absolutely, Shokutara. I just have a follow-up question to that, Shokutara. The Rohingya want to go back to Rakhine State and they want to go back to their villages of origin. In these locations, they might be living in the same place as perpetrators of violence. Have you given any thought, or have any of the women that you have spoken to given any thought to how to make that transition of living side by side with people, how that can be, what can be done for sexual violence survivors specifically?
Yes, that will be not possible for the victim to stay with the perpetrator in the same community, because if the perpetrator went to the jail, the perpetrator relative, their son, will the revenge their father the punishment from the victim. So it will be a different place where the victim should stay.
Fantastic. I think this is a really interesting area of research that perhaps you and Minara could look into, because I think it's a very important part of these ongoing conversations about repatriation, that there's some good information from community experts like yourself on how to manage transitions for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So another follow-up question for you, Shokutara, is that you mentioned that until you trained the women on different justice processes, they didn't really know the difference between them. So what do you think is most important for women to know about the differences between the different justice mechanisms?
Before the training, when I asked the woman, do you know what is ICC, what is ICJ, what is an IIMM? The majority of women do know about the justice mechanism. Then I explain about the justice process and what they do, what they can do, what will be done after the process. Then they realize.
Thank you, Shokutara. And what is it that they realized, and what did they think about the mechanisms once they came to a better understanding? So Sorry, Shokutara, you're on mute there.
Sorry, I just lost my internet. Can you please repeat the answer?
Yep.
Question.
No problem. When they learnt more about the mechanisms and what they do, what did women think about them, and how did that impact the way they felt about justice?
Okay. When I explained that some cases like ICC and Argentina about their specific crimes, and then some of the women make they learn to know about it. Also, ICJ cases only that about whether there was genocide. That is some things the women find important.
Okay, fantastic. Minara, I'm now going to pose a question for you, and we might have Shafi available to interpret if that makes you more comfortable. You spoke about your frustrations that the different justice mechanisms haven't consulted enough with women's groups in the camps. Do you have any recommendations for these institutions and how they could better connect with women?
Minara tomara hoyode tomara hoyode mani tomara hondilla harap lage de bodilla বিচারর জিনিস ইলের হন্দরন খারাপ হইলে লাগে দিয়া আমলে তোমারা হইও তো ইয়া আমাদের তারা হন্ডিলা গরি ফারিব দিয়া তুন ইলে হনো কিছু তোমারা তুন কইবেলা আছে না
ভাইয়া আসসালামু আলাইকুম বেগুনের শুক্রিয়া করি তো মানে আছে তো হন্ডা আইসিসির প্রসিকিউটর কল যদি আইতে যদি হইলে আরা কেমন মাঝে আরা জিন নাকি আরা সিভিল সোসাইটি অর্গানাইজেশন মাই মানে আরা ট্রেনিং করার দা আছে আরা তো অলরেডি ভিকটিম অফ দ্য উইকনেস কল আরা তো সেলেক্ট যে আছে আরা ট্রেনিং করার দে ডইলা ট্রেনিং করার দে মাই মানে কল আছে ইতার আরা লো কন্টাক্ট করি আর বুই আইলে কন্টাক্ট করি বাদা আরা লো কন্টাক্ট করি যদি কেমন মাঝে আরা লো দলত যদি দে ইতারা বেশি সুন্দর করে ভিকটিম অকল খবর অকল পাইব দে ইনলা তরিকা অকল আছে।
So first of all, greeting and thanks all for having me here. So the international investigator and other people related to the court and this mechanism, if they find the Rohingya women leads, civil society groups and Rohingya leaders based in the camp, they will find better victims, the original victims and witnesses from the camp through us. And if they don't find us, they can contact the BI who are connected to us. So through which they can find out the real victims and witnesses, so with whom they can directly talk to them.
Excellent. It might be very useful at this point if Shokutara, you explained a little bit more detail about the type of work that you've done to help reach out to the community and the type of programming that you've been doing with people in the camp, because you've seen excellent results and there is a monitoring and evaluation process that goes with that. So Shokutara, could you tell us a bit about the work that you have been doing with women in the camp to raise their awareness about international justice processes?
Shokutara বুঝে না
You're on mute, Shokutara.
Sorry about I lost my internet, so please repeat the question.
No problem, Shokutara. My question was,
I think Shokutara is with Minara. I think she's gone to, yeah.
Shokutara, my question was, you've been doing a lot of work on increasing the awareness of people in the, oh, we've lost Shokutara. I always like to say that when you're running these conversations and panel discussions in the camp, that it's just an extreme sport. You, you never know what's going to happen next, and you just need to roll with it. Look,
Minara will be able to answer this question as well.
Is she okay?
If she's
Minara.
there.
Just while we're waiting for them to come back, maybe Claire, I'll punt to you the question from the participants. I'm curious, what is the message to the global donor community, specifically that supports these mechanisms and processes for international justice more inclusively?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a tendency to kind of assume that because especially the ICC has gone so far down the road in trying to think about how to engage victims, that people think, okay, well, the court has an outreach department, it has the VPRS, and so that's the mechanism that through which we can ensure engagement with communities. But it was very clear, and we will circulate the research that we did afterwards. It goes into a lot of detail about this. But as you could even see from the beginning stages of the process, where the ICC did spend a lot of time and money kind of doing these visits to the camp, but it comes from The Hague, it flies people in, it meets with them for an hour, it explains what the process is, but there's not that, it's really hard for it to have that prolonged engagement and really getting the feedback back and having meaningful engagement that allow people to actually be involved in the design of the process. And an ongoing way as well. I mean, as Shokutara and Minara said, they trained over 1,000 women, and they are in the community with them all the time, and they are able to do follow-up questions, and they're able to talk to them in their own language. So when you combine with what the groups in the camp are able to do, with the assistance of, some international organizations, we obviously work really closely with the groups in the camp to make sure the technical messaging around the courts is correct. But I think you'll see, what we have been able to do with these groups, and Shokutara and Minara are leaders of 2 of them, but we work with 11 different groups in the camp, and they engage with the community on many different issues. They're able to just do so much more in so much, in a language that like literally and figuratively speaks to people on a very limited budget and with more time available to them. And I think it's what they're able to achieve is really deepening that engagement and understanding in a way that outreach departments at the IC that are really overstretched, that are dealing with 17 different situations that, by definition, don't speak in the language of the people in the community. They're not able to achieve it to the same extent. And so, of course, they have to work together. But I think the international community does tend to just kind of think that it's okay if they're just funding the outreach department of the ICC, and the ICC is on it, without really thinking about how that support also needs to go to particularly local and community-based organizations, but also with the support of some international organizations working in this area as well. So yeah, I would just think about that, diversifying the funding and looking at who is already doing the work, and also who is able to do the work in a really meaningful way.
And I'll just also add to that, Claire, thank you for that answer, that if you leave it up to each mechanism to be responsible for outreach, their outreach is also essentially their PR department, as opposed to allowing independent actors to walk with victims in order to hold these courts accountable and to ensure that these courts are actually meeting the needs and engaging with the community in an effective way. And people may have seen the recent visit from the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC to Cox's Bazar. And, people in the camp are not satisfied with the pace of the court and with how investigations are proceeding. And victims need to have spaces and support to hold these accountability mechanisms accountable themselves to ensure that they're meeting the needs of the community. Really happy that we've got Shokutara and Minara back. Shokutara, to go back to my previous question, did you want to tell everyone about the work that you do to raise people's awareness of the international accountability mechanisms in the camp?
Shokutara তোমার গিয়া হইবলা হদ্দে মানে তুমি দিন ক্যাম্পের মাঝে হাম করো মানুষের অ্যাওয়্যার করিবলা মানুষের বিভিন্ন ধরনের মামলা লই কি হাম করে হন্যা করে দে দিন মানুষের বুঝো এই সম্পর্কে তুমি আর কানা হইবে না
Minara, are you here?
মিনারা চাইলে তুমিও হইতে পারো ইয়ান সম্পর্কে I think they have this network issues. That's why.
I mean, I am really loath to speak on behalf of Showkutara and Minara usually, but neither of them.
হ্যালো আজানাল্লা বলে একা করে বোঝানো হয়েছে তাহলে মায়া হইন্দলা কি আল্লাহ জরুরি হলে আর মায়া হইন্দে নিজে আয় দা আইসিসি কি হাম করতো আইসিজে কি করতো আর্জেন্টিনায় কি করতো আইএমএম কি করতো আর না জানি আর না জানা জরিয়া বর্মার মাঝে যিনি কি আর রিয়েল ডকুমেন্ট আছে নি তারা লই ফেলা পাইছি তারা যদি এলে অপরচুনিটি আর মায়া হইন্দলা রাইট আছে যে আর হই পারি যদি আর শিখি না চালে আর শিখনা জরুরি কি আর বাড়াই না পারে ফান মুমিকা বাড়াই না পারে ফান আর খনা হাম আর মানুষে বেগুন আইসিসি গড়ি দিব এরা আশা করি থাকি আইসিসি কি গরম দিয়ে আনো মানুষে ক্লিয়ার ভাবে খনে কি হাম করে ইয়া জানানা জরুরি ন জানে দি ইতার আর শিখনা জরুরি
So sorry, it was a little bit disturbed because of the call to prayer time, and yeah, even I, Minara, myself did not know much more about this international mechanism system before I was learning. I was getting training, and as we did not know anything, that's why Myanmar government and military could snatch away our original documents, burn them. We didn't know how to preserve them, and now if we can learn, we and the other women also say the same that if we can learn, think about justice mechanism, if we got more training, and if we get more encouragement, then it will be benefit for us. And we would like to ask international people to come forward to give us more opportunities in learning things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Minara. It's a real shame that we've lost Rita. Claire, I don't know if you've...
She's really struggling, but she did just send me her overall recommendation that she wanted me to read out if she can't reconnect, which it seems like she can't. So I'll just read that out now.
Sure.
So she says, the only people who can decide what survivors of conflict-related sexual violence need are the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Too often, international institutions speak on behalf of women when the women speak for themselves. We recommend that the survivors' voices are at the heart of every stage of the peace process and that the needs they recommend are awarded the highest priority. It is not enough to note their existence. We must include them tangibly and let them speak directly to the reconciliation process that they themselves need.
Thank you, Claire. One question that I want to put to the group is so often when people are talking about survivors of sexual violence, they talk about the need for anonymity and confidentiality, and often that's a barrier to engagement or to international mechanisms wanting to engage. I mean, so often I've heard international mechanisms saying, oh, we don't want to expose survivors of sexual violence. We don't want to, but at the same time, that becomes a reason not to engage them or not to have methods of engaging them, which is why they get left out. So the question I'd like to put to Minara and Showkutara first is, how can mechanisms engage survivors of sexual violence whilst respecting I won't sort of presume that it's confidentiality, whilst being sensitive to their needs. Shafi, could you interpret, please?
Yep. Shokutara the Minara Tonar Dian Hote yan international এই বিচারর বাবদে বিভিন্ন সম্পর্ক বাবদে যারা রেপ ভিকটিম আছে সেক্সুয়াল ভায়োলেন্স হতে এদেরলা ভিকটিম যারা আছে ইতারার হতাই নরে ছুপাই রাখি বললা ন হবে বিভিন্ন জায়গা ফ্লাশ নগরি বললা ন হবে বললা ইয়ান গুরি হ তো এ ধরনের গরিয়রে এনলা মানুষ অরলই এনলা যারা আছে ইতারা আল্লাহ যদি হতাবার্তা হওয়া চলে ইয়ান আমাদের খেঙ্গুরু সুন্দর করে হতাবার্তা কল হওয়া যাবে ইয়ান তোরা হওয়ার জন্য তারা ভালো হবে
Vaya ara zini ki maya fana kol tenin gora era ara bitin real bitin mokol lot pai to lot pai itar ar khota batara in jodi lot jodi itar ar mane ekka safe jaga maze loi jay ba itar hotare confidential raki ere itar ar jodi itar ar emotion itar ar jodi 100 jodi na ara itar ar in the empathy da ba confidential raki ere information kol lo poribo real bitin minda jodi loite mona hode confidential raki ere loite mona hode le ara tenin tar botu asa din tu loi paribo.
yes during our training season and outreach in the community the real victims of sexual violence and rape victims share their things to us because we are also women. If international people and investigator want to talk to them, they need to be at a safe place where they feel comfortable. Sometimes when this kind of victims uh, talks about their experiences, they sometimes cry out. So that's when we need to stop. We need to give them some spaces so that they can feel good, so that they can share the things with us. So they trust the people they know already, especially women. So through them, people can engage.
Thank you, Minara. That's a fantastic piece of insight, and it's absolutely yes. Frequently, I have people asking me, how can I access survivors of sexual violence? And I think your answer is absolutely spot on. That survivors are going to come forward to people they know, people they trust, people who speak the same language. So unless these mechanisms have a close relationship with the community, then how can they expect survivors to be willing to come forward and to give their story? So thank you very much for that insight. Shokutara, did you have anything to contribute?
Yes, already Minara mentioned about it. When we do training with the women, there's a lot of women who came from like GBB rape case. So then when we talk about a different justice mechanism, then they share about their feeling that we experience. We have this kind of document we face when we were members. All those things they share us.
Thank you, Shokutara. One question I want to put before we move towards wrapping up. At VAI, we often say our kind of unofficial slogan is justice is about making victims feel better. So whether or not it's about winning a case, whether or not it's about finding your power and engaging in advocacy, whether it's about being a part of decision making that affects your future, we consider all of these are components that go into making victims feel better and assisting them on their road forward out of an experience of mass atrocity. So my question for you, Shokutara and Minara, when she returns, is, in your experience, also as people who have fled mass atrocities, what is it that makes victims feel better in this context, and what can we do to contribute to those efforts?
So, সেগুলো তার কনজেন্স ওয়াল যে ইয়ান হইলে হদে আরা যেতে ধরনের মানুষ হইলে হতা হয় ইনে জ্ঞান ইয়ান করে ইয়ান হইলে ভিকটিম যারা মানে বিচারের মানে হইলে ভিকটিম যারা আছে তারা তখন বালা লাগো কাম বালা লাগে দে ইয়ান হইলে তারা বিচার মানে এটা তখন লাগি বালা লাগে ইয়ান তো এইবা তোরার দিবা দর উগ যাই জুলুম খাই এরা মানুষের তলাইছে মানুষ হলবে আইরে কেবল তাকে ইতারার সাওগান কি ইতারা হন্ডিলা হইয়ান আমাদের
zulum itara mani bisara se yan go victim Allah bili yan mani itara hana direct yan ogi ogi hana yan na paibo magor mun tu no fani tara ki gorod yan bisar hode sath de Then hole to ahon camp maze ta karan hole itara ICC maze fotigo in the kuta kolama itara to insab gote long process. Then dila ahon camp maze itara ta ga board le itara kyokol face gorers and dila niki traumatized face gole and then ono ham horos na ashanti gorers. Then dila itara tun me doila bodle ahon saputa kol nano beshi zoruri.
So such kind of victims share with us that what happened to us cannot be bring back or would not be come back. So what what we think is if we are being supported, if we are engaged in some kind of things where we can be busy and we can be feel free, that would be the much better thing that we feel better.
Ta to are there can from us do manus has become a combat can atrocity crime a call gag the manus. Then the lighter and is a hell gorilla, either at Thomas to hill gorilla and the training of calls and the Lara already literary. Tarendila document a call zoom as in or a collect gorilla come evidence or a destroy no gorifan and the Arab guru training the valley bishop.
So I have one more thing, that is the almost everyone in the camp in Bangladesh face this uh, ethnic cleansing, which is actually genocide. So these people are traumatized. They want to get training like the training we were given to women, and even also men want the same thing so that they can come out from this trauma, so they can build up themselves.
ভাইয়া হাতও হইতো মনে হচ্ছে জিনকে আহারা victim হয়ে আজার রোহিঙ্গা আরা এক কোমেরে জুলুম গজ্জে তো কোম গজ মুড়ারে যখন গজ্জে তো আরা যেতদিন বাংলাদেশের মাঝে আছি এতদিন আরা জিন নাকি জুলুম গজ্জে মাই মানে কলে রে গজ্জে ইতারা তো মাইনতি বাপি বাপি তাকে মানুষ ডইলা বডইলা ট্রাফিক নিজর গয় এটা কেমন মাঝে লড়াচড়া করি না পারি কেমন সিচুয়েশনের সাইরে বরবাদ তার গয় গর উতর ফনকা হাম করি না পারে হানতে হানতে তারা তো বিয়ারামো যার গয় ইন মাইনত তো জাগই ভাঙ্গরি ইতারা তো গম লাগে যে ইন ইতারা মাইনে তুই যাগ মহর ইনসাফ করা তা করিব আইসিজি তো আরারে মদতি আং গরা করিব আর কোমেরে মহরি তারা মাইনে তো জাগো ভাঙ্গরি তারারে কেঙ্গরি লই যাগে পারে এ তরিকা মজিনি তারারে এ ওয়েলেরি তারারে জিন্দা গরা করে ট্রেনিং দিয়া বড়ুক সাপোর্ট করা বড়ুক ইন্দা গরম না জরুরি বলি বুঝি না
So one more thing from Minara is uh, it's only one ethnic group, that is Rohingya, who we are tortured and who were raped, their houses burned down. So these people being in the camp, they keep on thinking on different things because they are not busy with things, and they are also getting traffic. They are also having problems in the camps. So to feel better, to come out, let alone the justice, ongoing justice in ICC and ICJ and in Argentina. So it would be good if people get training, people get psychological support, so that they can forget the trauma they face in Myanmar.
Hmm. Can I ask Minar, and maybe this question is on a different topic, but there are psychosocial support services available in the camp provided by humanitarian organizations. Are these used by the community, or are you talking about something else in terms of psychosocial support?
তো মিনাফাডার কান হতা হয়তো ইয়ানলদে মানে বিভিন্ন অনজিও যেটা কাম করে ইতারা সাইকোলজিক্যাল সাপোর্ট অল যে আছে মানুষের এন কি আসলে নাকি অত অন্য ধরনের করে হতা হতে
ভাইয়া সাইকোসোশিয়াল সাপোর্ট হদে আয় অনর শান্তি ফুটিকে আমার মাথায় বড় কত দর করে সেন্টার অকল বান্ধি যে আছে অনেও মান্য করছে যিন নাকি হোস কমিউনিটি কল আছে একজনের সাপোর্ট লা একজনের শান্তি লাভ হয়ে দিয়ে যেটা আছে মহর হাম হদে কিছু নাই তো এটা হনো দূরে মায়া হয় না কল উগা হচ্ছে মায়া পরে এইবার তারি কালে টেনি না এটা সাপোর্ট লইতে চাইলে কমিউনিটি দেখে যে মাইন্ড করে দিয়ে না নিজে অশান্তি হয় গড় ভুতর বই থাকে যে নাকি আরাতে আইসিসি হয়ে ট্রেনিং দিয়ে আইসিজি ট্রেনিং দিয়ে এনলে অলরেডি আরা কমেরা আরা গড় ভুতর সেফ লই থাকে এদিকে আরা যদি আরা অলরেডি সাইকোসোশিয়াল ট্রেনিং ভাই দিন তো আরা জেদ্দুর ভারে দুষি গায় কে তারা দূরে শান্তি হানা যাইতো না সাদি শান্তি হানা যাইলে 10-12 আড়ি যা পরে এখন গাড়ি নাই তো মানুষের রাস্তা মাঝে এফটিজিং করে ইয়ান একখান আর একখান এটা যাদের মানুষে দেখে মাইন্ড করে দিয়ে ইয়াক্কান বহুত দিলা রিজনের জরিয়ে মানুষ না যা এত আরা ট্রেনিং করে দিয়ে তরিকা মো জিনো দিদি তার যদি এনে সাপোর্ট যদি আরা কেমন বুতরে তাকে ঘর বুতর তাকে দিবাইতাম বেশি বের করে তো
So yes, uh, there are NGO buildings, there are big centers of psychosocial support in different places, which is far away, mostly from the victim houses. So the victims, many of them are young women who don't want to travel far away. And since it's been more than 1 year that there are no vehicles allowed to run around the camp, so this victim need to go far away to meet them. Where they also face different kind of problem, like people from the community mind it, don't take it easy. They also face teasing, and that's why the way we train women, like being in the community through this, if people are also given psychosocial support, being at their home through their own community, it would be the best.
Thank you very much, Minara. We're at time now, so I'm just going to briefly, wrap up and say thank you so much to Showkutara and Minara for joining us for this panel. It's been very enlightening for us, and we're grateful for the time you've given to share your experience. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Claire, for the work you've been doing with Showkutara and Minara, and everyone is looking forward to seeing the research published so we can learn more on how to do better at this. And Shafi, thank you very much for your interpretation. Fantastic as always. So I hope you all enjoyed the panel discussion. Please feel free to reach out to us afterwards if you have any further questions or comments. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.